Looking back at changes in our lives during the last few years, those pandemic mandated social distancing times, the isolation, stress, job and business losses, children and grandchildren having to do school at home or a cross breed, they call it, of school and homeschool. So many people vulnerable to the darkness of depression and anxiety. And for those who already suffer from periods of clinical depression, this was a particularly challenging time to pay attention to self-care. Really an important time for all of us to do just that. Depression and anxiety have three kinds of causes: biological, psychological, and social. We aren't machines with broken parts. We're human beings, human animals whose needs are not being met. Johann Hari, the author of Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions, says, we all need to have community, need to have meaningful values, meaningful work, need to feel respect, to spend time in the natural world, and to feel some security in a future. He goes on to say we all need social and spiritual balance in our lives. The pain of depression and anxiety can be seen as a signal. Rather than suppress or dull it, listen to it. Let it guide you away from the things hurting and draining you toward what will meet your needs. I brought this just to give you a look. Johann Hari's book that I just mentioned, Lost Connections, it's pretty dense, but it is full of very important stories of the research he did, the people he met over years of research. And there's all kinds of things to look up in the back. What a long list of footnotes he has, if you're so inclined. There's also, I noticed online, like a summary book of this. So I'm going to be telling everybody about it. In fact, I need to go back and really, really sit with it because I read pretty fast in order to share with you some of the latest thoughts on this. Lost Connections. That speaks to a lot of what's been happening over the last several years to all of us. Depression and anxiety have been on the rise in Western culture long before the pandemic descended on us. Over 2 years of social distancing, isolation, fear, lack of face-to-face community connections, depression and anxiety have taken root in the lives of many people. Maybe just a low level of disease, and it hasn't yet subsided. As a group together, we need to change our culture. The hunger for change is all around us. The children have had such great loss in their social connections, which is a rise in depression, anxiety, and anger. Anger. You've seen it all around you. Maybe sometimes it's pretty subtle, but there's a lot of it. In seminary, I studied the work of Harvard professor Robert Putnam. His research was published in the book titled Bowling Alone. Maybe some of you are familiar with his work. And for decades, he studied the way people come together to do things in groups. And he found that between 1985 and 1994, active involvement in community organizations decreased by 45%. And it's gotten worse. People quit coming together to do things in community and turned inward. Social scientists have found the number of close friends people can count on in times of crisis used to be, people would say 3, maybe at the utmost 4. Now it's down to 1 or none. That's scary. Loss of social connection, loneliness, depression, anxiety, and as I've said before, even anger are often very connected. And let us remember, there are different kinds of depression caused by, of course, an imbalancing in the brain. Sometimes one thing happens before the other. There's basically, sometimes there is a faulty regulation in the brain for balance by genetic vulnerability and by stressful life events. None of us are immune, and depression is not the same for all people. Even though pharmaceutical companies market medication as though they have the cure for what ails you, such unrealistic advertising contributes to confusion and misunderstandings. Advertising thrives on selling inadequacy and pushing the need to buy the product for people to feel whole. Hardly a day passes that we don't see a commercial advertising a medication for depression. And it's important to remember, not every person in psychological distress has a mental disorder. Anxiety and depression can be situational, but people we care about still suffer. Knowing how to help or be supportive challenges us. Social scientists are uncovering evidence that depression and anxiety are caused by some crucial and growing problems with the way we live today. And throughout history, people have suffered with depression. Even though stigma still exists concerning depression and other forms of mental illness, many people do repair their health and their lives with the help of medical intervention and therapy, making changes in the way they live. Most likely, depression has been a problem for humanity since the beginning of time. The writings of Hippocrates are among some of the earliest to describe an understanding of depression. He declared depression was essentially an illness of the brain that should be treated with oral remedies. I think what those were back then. Later, the religious superstitions of the Dark and Middle Ages sent ideas about mental health spiraling downward. It became accepted when one experienced persistent downheartedness. That was clear evidence that a person had fallen out of favor with God. People of authority believed anyone who lacked joy obviously was without faith in Christ and was consequently condemned, and might even be consorting with the devil. St. Augustine picked that religious belief up, and eventually demon possession became attached to depression, so that during the Inquisition, people were fined or imprisoned for the sin of feeling downhearted, feeling depressed. During the Renaissance, there were writings about the foothold Satan got when one entertained a depressive mood, saying that above all other invitations, a melancholy-like constitution of body tempts Satan. Some demonic ideas began to be countered by when scientific studies advanced. Beginning in the early 1900s with the work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Abraham, knowledge of mental health disorders advanced, but society and some religious groups still need to catch up with modern mental health knowledge. Dr. Andrew Solomon, psychologist and author of the book, The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression, feels if you understand the history of depression, you'll then understand the history of humanity. Also, when you look at the isolation and social changes of modern Western culture, you will notice a steady increase in the incidence of depression and anxiety as people become more isolated and less socially connected. We are creatures who want to be in community, who need community to be whole. In 2020, I came across an article published in the UU World by Kenny Wiley, religious educator. It's titled 3 Ways Unitarian Universalism Has Helped Me with My Depression. Unitarian Universalism has taught him about personal responsibility. And Kenny says, My depression is not my fault. It is, however, my responsibility. He was first diagnosed at age 13, where rage against himself and others close to him characterized his behavior and life at that time. Vicious self-talk was also a problem that tore at him. He had to learn to figure out which parts or symptoms of his depression weren't his fault and for what he must take responsibility for. As a teenager, medication helped, but Wiley also credits his mom for helping him learn how to mitigate the disease's effects through what they began to call the Big Four. After the rule, it was sort of fashioned for them after the rules that governed the UU youth rallies in the Southwest District at that time. Together, they developed a Big Four checklist. Number 1, have you eaten lately? 2, have you slept? 3, have you exercised lately? 4, have you read anything good or learned anything fascinating lately? Depression robs a person of the inclination to take care of yourself. And Kinney says, such rituals don't fix things immediately, but the ritual of achieving small wins keeps the suicidal thoughts at bay. Being a Unitarian Universalist has taught Kinney that he is not alone as he faces depression. My faith communities and close UU relationships have kept me alive, he says. My church friends refuse to give up on me. That helps shout down depression's mantra that I am unworthy and unholy. Those who sit with us in hard times are saying through their actions that we are worthy of love. Kinney says, as it reminds us, or wants to remind us, that Unitarian Universalists, we teach our children, you are already good. You are already enough. Unitarian Universalism has told Kinney that over and over again. Though we sometimes fall short, at our best, that's who we are, what we believe. You are enough. Author, educator, and activist Parker Palmer says he had folks coming to him who wanted to help him when he was struggling with depression. They wanted to be helpful, but sadly, many of them weren't. People would say things like, it's a beautiful day outside. Go feel the sunshine, smell the flowers. That leaves a person more depressed, he says. For Palmer, he said, there was this one friend who came after asking permission to do so. He came every afternoon at 4 o'clock. Hardly saying anything, he sat down in a chair in the living room, took off Parker's shoes and socks, and massaged his feet. What he mainly did for me, Parker says, was be willing to be present to me in my suffering. He just hung there with me in this very quiet, very simple, very tactile way. It became a metaphor of the kind of community we need to extend to people who are suffering in this way, which is a community that is willing to hold people in a space, a sacred space of relationship, where this person can heal in their own way, in their own time. Dark times in our lives are filled with that uncertainty, feelings of emptiness, failure, loneliness, temptation, so many other challenges. And for Parker Palmer, at a time of burnout and depression as a young social worker, it forced him to leave his job and subsequently reevaluate his life. He describes that time as a deadly darkness when the faculties he had always depended on just collapsed. Emotionless, ego-shattered, and intellectually useless, Parker writes, deep in the thickets of our inner wilderness, I could sense the presence of something that knew how to stay alive even when the rest of me wanted to die. That something was my tough and tenacious soul. I've known the darkness of situational depression a couple of times in my life, both part of grief. And one of those times, my Unitarian Universalist minister was the lifeline who listened and whose presence and understanding guided me back to my true self, helped me to remember I too am enough. When I asked two of my former congregation's members who have struggled with depression most of their lives, what would they like people to know about depression? One person said, having people tell you to cheer up doesn't help. The person suffering from depression can get pretty good at disguising their true feelings. Feeling sorry for self doesn't help. Depression is a brain chemistry problem. Genetics may make some people more vulnerable, but isolation, loss of connection with others can trigger brain chemistry problems. You can't change things by pretending. Medication does help, but it's not the only solution. He mentioned that anxiety and other mental health disorders, like obsessive compulsive disorder, can also be a problem with someone who suffers from depression. His Unitarian Universalist faith had provided important community and acceptance for him. It had been a time of healing in retirement to explore his creative side, which brings him joy. The other person I asked about how their UU faith helped in time of depression or dealing with the depression said this: I have a very hard time accepting the idea that the complexity of Earth's living creative creatures is accidental or random. So I have to believe in some super intelligent creative force that started the evolutionary process of life in its infinite variety. But it seems to me the Creator got bored, walked away without looking back. So I suppose my faith is rooted in the idea that there is more good in most people than bad. But the bad makes for more interesting news stories. It certainly gets more attention. She said, I depend on the good winning out in the end, but the battle seems endless. What would you like people to know about depression, I asked. And she answered, I suppose depression is different for different people. My own depressions are not always the same. Sometimes it comes from situations. Other times it seems to come from nowhere at all. It's just a dark cloud blotting out all joy and interest. Any words of wisdom you'd like me to know about depression, I asked? In my case, the phrases, this too shall pass, nothing lasts forever, and one day at a time keep me hanging on during the worst. Perhaps I'm fortunate to have seen others endure depressions and come out of them so that I never feel absolutely hopeless. The knowledge that it is a temporary condition is important. Hope is essential. Each spring during my time in ministry, I've attended the Faith Connections on Mental Illness conference. One year, Nancy Kehoe, a psychologist and Catholic nun, spoke on the topic faith, mental illness, and the journey to wholeness. I remember being reminded that the meaning of religio in Roman times, she said later, that it is the meaning to bind back, to reconnect. That understanding gives meaning to the intersection of faith and depression, for religious action, for connection. Dr. Kehoe has herself, at one time in her life, maybe more than that, suffered from depression. So she knows, besides being a psychologist, she knows what she's talking about, especially being rooted in the church as a nun. She says, in the experience of isolation, offer hope. In the face of stigma, shame, offer acceptance. In the face of poor self-esteem, offer self-worth. In the face of loss of meaning, offer meaning and purpose. Author Annie Lamott tells us, hope begins in the dark. The stubborn hope that if you just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. You wait and watch and work, You don't give up. The darkness knows healing. The darkness knows change. In the dark, discover who you are, what your life is about. A dark night of the soul may hold blessings that enable you to find your way. Chemical antidepressants that help people but are not the only answer. The other antidepressant is community. Important connections occur that help people empower one another to change or enrich their lives. Although disconnection may be one of the main drivers of depression and anxiety, ways to reconnect exist here in this spiritual community. Our Unitarian Universalist faith reminds us, take courage, friends. You are not alone. May it be so. Amen.